going to skim over a larger portion of the book of Job tonight. We're going to have a look at chapters 16 through 20, and we are considering this under the subject, the problem of misunderstanding God. And we are just here making something of a sketch of two of the speeches by Job and speeches by two of his friends. We are just going to survey the whole portion and draw from it what we can about this subject of the problem of misunderstanding God. We have Job's speech, first one here in chapters 16 and 17. Bildad speaks. The record of that is in chapter 18. We have Job responding, recorded in chapter 19, and then Zophar's address in chapter 20. Let me just read the beginning of chapter 16. Then Job answered, I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. Is there no limit to windy words? Or what plagues you that you answer? I too could speak like you, if I were in your place. I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would lessen your pain. And let me read the first two verses of chapter 17. My spirit is broken, my days are extinguished, the grave is ready for me. Surely mockers are with me, and my eye gazes on their provocation. Our subject, the problem of misunderstanding God. God is the most misunderstood person in the universe. And the amazing thing is that he doesn't do anything about it. God isn't like we are. Who was it? Augustine, I believe, said, God deliver me from the lust of of always having to justify myself. That's the way we are. It is a lust. It's something that we don't get taken care of as we ought to in our lives, but we're always justifying ourselves. Whenever there's any sort of implication against us, right away we come to our own defense. God never does. Most misunderstood person in the universe. He doesn't try to defend himself. Human suffering is one of the main reasons for this misunderstanding of God. The fact of human suffering in the world and the fact of tragedy that takes place over and over again in the world, these are the main reasons for the misunderstanding of God, attributing to Him cruelty and, at the best, indifference. It is the root of a good deal of at least agnosticism, if not atheism. The fact of all the tragedy and suffering that's in the world. C.S. Lewis has done a pretty good job of answering this problem in men's minds. But nevertheless, it is there. We see it in this portion of Scripture that there is on the part of Job, there is on the part of his so-called comforters, a misunderstanding of God, a misunderstanding of God's way, a misunderstanding of God's character. I should just point out in passing that Job continues to maintain that he is innocent. That is, that he is not being punished for his sin, that he's not a wicked man. And this is the continuing charge of his so-called comforters, that he has to be wicked in order to suffer the way that he is. Remember that syllogism that I gave you way at the beginning of our discussions in Job, that is erroneous because one of its propositions is wrong? But the syllogism that these men are setting forth, it's something like this, or that what's back of their thinking is that the major premise is that only the wicked suffer, or you might state it that suffering is an evidence of being wicked. That's the major proposition. The minor proposition is Job is suffering. The conclusion, Job is wicked. Now it's that syllogism on which these friends of Job are operating. This is their theology. This is their doctrine that they have built up. They can't deviate from their doctrine. So they've got to fit Job in. They fit him in as a man who is wicked. He has to be wicked. They come to that conclusion. And Job constantly is coming back. He knows he's not a wicked man. He can't explain why he is suffering all this tragedy and misery that he is experiencing. He can't understand it. He turns around, however, and blames God. And that's what we're going to see here. And I think that the problem involved for them and the problem that would be involved for us that we need to get a hold of is this: viewing experience apart from revelation is bound to bring a misunderstanding of God. Viewing experience apart from revelation is bound to bring a misunderstanding of God. If you look at circumstances without studying the Bible, you are going to misunderstand God. As we've said different times, I believe that it is impossible for a person to be a thinker and look at the circumstances in this life without being a pessimist, apart from the revelation of what you'll find revealed in the Bible. If you have your eyes open and look around you and see what is going on in the world, and don't just slough it off, but stop and think of it and consider it and look into it, you've got to be a pessimist. You can't be anything else apart from an understanding of what is taught in this Word. So it's important that we get at the revelation then. If viewing experiences apart from revelation is bound to bring a misunderstanding of God, we don't want to misunderstand God. But here these three men, I'd like to share with you that I believe there are three assumptions that bring about this misunderstanding of God. Three assumptions on the basis of human experience which result in misunderstanding God. The first assumption that comes out, particularly in connection with what Job has to say in these various discourses of his, tragedy is assumed to indicate the opposition of God. Tragedy is assumed to indicate the opposition of God. That is, and you just check it if you don't experience this in your own life, in your own thinking. And if you don't think of it sometimes as far as your own self is concerned, when something goes wrong, you get the idea, well, God must be against me. And when you see it go wrong in other people, the first conclusion you jump at is, well, God must be against him. Now, that is a faulty assumption. It is an assumption that leads to misunderstanding God, that tragedy is assumed to indicate the opposition of God. With Job, he felt that it was an opposition that was without cause. Notice his claim on this. He has said something similar before, made similar statements, but in chapter 16, verse 17, after he has gone through a listing of some of the things that God is doing against him, and is told how deeply he has gone down. Verse 16, my face is flushed from weeping, and deep darkness is on my eyelids. Now notice, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. What he is saying is there is no cause. There's opposition I'm getting from God. There is no cause in me for it. But that I am experiencing the tragedy. So it proves that God is against me. I'm up against the opposition of God. Job cries out about the hopelessness of his condition. Oh, the dark statements that he makes here. And he's not exaggerating about how he feels. Chapter 17 there, the first verse. My spirit is broken, my days are extinguished. I think that this is about the worst thing that can happen to a person, to have his spirit broken. You can't go on if your spirit is broken. You know, you can stand to have your body broken and still keep on. But if your spirit is broken, you see this even in the lower animals. I know I used to know that in connection with horses when I was a boy, horses on the farm, that you've got to break a horse in order that he's going to be any good at all. But if the breaking is done in the wrong way, that he isn't brought into right discipline, but if he's broken in the wrong way, his spirit will be broken and he won't be any good. But it's all the worse with a human being. And here is one thing that we need to be so very careful about. You see, these friends of Job had contributed to the breaking of his spirit. They hadn't comforted him. He has to chide them about it as he talks to them of how, there in the first verse of chapter 16, he identified them as being sorry comforters. That's what they were, sorry comforters. And he tells them that if our places were exchanged, I could sit here and shake my head at you. That's what they were evidently doing. He said, I too could speak to you if I were in your place. I could compose words against you and I could shake my head at you. But he tells them that he wouldn't do it that way. What he would rather do, he tells there in verse 5, and this is where we ought to take a lesson from him as to what we should do when somebody is in need. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would lessen your pain. That's the place that we should be in, to give solace and to give strengthening by our words. And we'll see a little more, a little later on, how they had done just exactly the opposite of this, and by the way they had spoken, they had broken his spirit. His hopeless condition, he speaks of it further down here in chapter 17. There in verse 13, if I look for Sheol as my home, I make my bed in the darkness. If I call to the pit, you are my father, to the worm, my mother and my sister. Where now is my hope? And who regards my hope? Will it go down with me to Sheol? Shall we together go down into the dust? His condition is hopeless. He has no hope but going down into Sheol. It's all over for him. He tells elsewhere here how the light has gone out for him. But notice now, he thinks it is God who is doing all of this to him. Chapter 16, beginning with verse 6. In chapter 16, verses 6 through 14, you find Job delineating this, setting it forth, that it is God who has devastated him. God has caused all of this. If I say my pain is not lessened, and if I hold back, what is left me? But now he has exhausted me. It's God who has exhausted me. Thou hast laid waste all my company. Thou, that's God he is addressing, thou hast shriveled me up. It has become a witness, and my leanness rises up against me. It testifies to my face. His anger, God's anger, has torn me and hunted me down. He has gnashed at me with his teeth. My adversary glares at me. He figures that God is his enemy. They have gaped at me with their mouth. They have slapped me on the cheek with contempt. They have massed themselves against me. God hands me over to ruffians and tosses me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, but he, God, shattered me, and he has grasped me by the neck and shaken me to pieces. He has also set me up as his target. My, look at the graphic expressions that he is using here. Job is saying that God has taken me like a dog picks up an animal by the neck and shakes it. That's the way God's treating me. And God has used me as a target, he says. He's made a target out of me, and he has shot his arrows at me. It's God who is against me. He has set me up as his target. His arrows surround me without mercy. He splits my kidneys open. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks through me with breach after breach. He runs at me like a warrior. God is his enemy. God is opposing him. He thinks that God has devastated him. He believes that God is fighting against him. Chapter 19, this comes out. Chapter 19, beginning with verse 6. You hear his declaration, know then that God has wronged me, and has closed his net around me. Behold, I cry violence, but I get no answer. That is, he says he's getting no answer to his prayer at all. He cries out to God that this is violence. He's crying out for help, but I get no answer. I shout for help, but there is no justice. There's many a person in the darkness of trial. If he looks at the circumstances, he has to say there is no justice. It just is not fair. God is not fair. Notice further what he expresses there about God fighting against him. He has walled up my way so that I cannot pass, and he has put darkness on my paths. He has stripped my honor from me and removed the crown from my head. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone. And he has uprooted my hope like a tree. God has done all of this, Job says. Uprooted my hope like a tree. He has also kindled his anger against me and considered me as his enemy. His troops come together and build up their way against me and camp around my tent. God is against me. He has removed my brothers far from me, and so on. This comes into another category that of what the tragedy assumed to indicate the opposition of God. Job believes that God has turned everyone against him. Talk about feeling paranoid, but it was true. Everybody was against Job. Everybody had turned against him. The record indicates so. But what Job is saying, that God has done this. Notice verse 13. He has removed my brothers far from me, and my acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My relatives have failed, and my intimate friends have forgotten me. Those who live in my house and my maids consider me a stranger. I am a foreigner in their sight. In other words, no one who has had anything to do with him before wants to have anything to do with him now. He's a stranger. He's an outcast to everyone who has known him. Notice, and he says, God has done all this. Notice the response he gets from his servant. I call to my servant, but he does not answer. I have to implore him with my mouth. His servant, he's got to beg him, please, will you do something for me? Because otherwise the servant just disregards him. And then, on all of this, he evidently has a bad case of bad breath. My breath is offensive to my wife. She can't stand to be near to me. And I am loathsome to my own brothers. Remember what he's saying, that God has done all of this. God has turned all of these people against me. Even young children despise me. I rise up and they speak against me. All my associates abhor me, and those I love have turned against me. But he indicates it's God who has done this. He believes it is God who has turned everyone against him. He has said it earlier in chapter 17, verse 6. How God has turned people against him, but God has made me a byword of the people, and I am one at whom men spit. What a come down. Later on, we're going to find Job telling about his past, where he was such an outstanding man that when he would walk down the street, important people would stand up in his presence. They'd stand up to honor him. Now, he has fallen to the place, and he says it's God who has done it against me, that he is just a byword mouthed by the people, and he's one at whom men spit. This is what God has done, he feels. And then the reason why this has happened, Job believes that God has closed the minds of people from understanding him, because nobody understands him. And this is really one of the problems of the suffering person, the person who is really in in the depths of darkness, he is not understood. And Job accuses God of this in chapter 17, verses 4 and 5. For thou hast kept their heart from understanding, therefore thou wilt not exalt them. He who informs against friends for a share of the spoil, the eyes of his children also shall languish. God, you've kept their heart from understanding. You're the one who's turned everyone against me. They can't understand my problem because you have kept them from understanding. And then, regarding his physical problem, chapter 19, beginning with verse 20. My bone clings to my skin and my flesh, and I have escaped only by the skin of my teeth. Incidentally, did you know that commonly used expression is from the Bible? Here's the first use of that. He escaped by the skin of his teeth. It's a common expression used. Well, Job was the first one who said it. Pity me, O you, my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. He says the physical condition, this terrible physical condition he has, with skin drying up or else the sores running and all, and the skin getting tight over the bones, and in all of the suffering he has. Why do you persecute me as God does, and are not satisfied with my flesh? But the reason for it, that he thinks, verse 21, for the hand of God has struck me. God has smitten me. He has stricken me. That's the reason for my physical problem. Well, you see, that's the first assumption that is the basis for misunderstanding God. Tragedy is assumed to indicate the opposition of God. The second assumption, we get this from the discourses of his friends, the so-called comforters. The second assumption that leads to misunderstanding of God, the sufferer is assumed to be forsaken by God. The sufferer is assumed to be forsaken by God. And because of this terrible assumption that these friends of Job had arrived at, what they have to say to Job is absolutely devastating. Here again, I would plead for it. Be real careful. Be very slow at arriving at conclusions concerning the person who is going through testings and trials. We shouldn't close our eyes to it. If there is apparent sin in the person's life, then it may be that the rod of God is being laid on that person. But if there is no apparent sin, and if from all outward appearances the person is seeking to walk with the Lord and yet being put through devastating trials, you must not arrive at the conclusion that proves that he is forsaken by God, or that God is against him. That's what these men did, and they told Job in no uncertain terms, and the result of it was what we saw there in chapter 17, his broken spirit, and we have it further in let's see here in chapter 16 and verse 20. My friends are my scoffers, my eye weeps to God. And then in chapter 19, notice how he describes what they're doing to him. Then Job responded, how long will you torment me and crush me with words? He is crushed by the words that they are speaking. And the words you speak can be more devastating than physical blows. Spoken words can be more cutting than the sharpest knife. They can be absolutely devastating to a person. And you know, it's strange how people feel justified in using that kind of words and that kind of language when they believe a person is forsaken by God, or when they believe that a person is deceived. I've had a little bit of experience with this. And it's absolutely amazing what people feel, what Christian people feel they can say to somebody if they believe that that person is deceived. They use words that crush, that pound, that devastate. It's because they are assuming what Job's comforters here assume, that God is against you. That's why this is happening to you. What in this assumption that the sufferer is assumed to be forsaken by God, misfortunes are identified as the lot of the wicked. And notice how this comes out in the addresses of these men. In chapter 18, we find that in verse 5, it's down in verse 11. We see that he's talking about the wicked here, Bildad, as he is speaking. Verse 5, he says, the light of the wicked goes out. And then he goes on to delineate about what happens to him. That in verse 11, all around terrors frighten him and harry him at every step, and his strength is famished, and calamity is ready at his side. His skin is devoured by disease. The firstborn of death devours his limbs. He is torn from the security of his tent, and they march him before the king of terrors. Now, the thing that must be recognized here, as you read each one of these, almost every one of them can be coupled, can be seen as a description of what Job was going through. And what he is saying is that that's the lot of the wicked. That's what happened with Job. What's happening to you, that's what happens to wicked people. And so God has forsaken you. There is no doubt about it. And the humiliation he is experiencing, chapter 20, verse 5, the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless is momentary. But they're saying all along, Job, you used to be a big shot. There was a time when you were a great, important man, but it's been cut short. You used to be a man of great joy. You don't have joy anymore. See, it was momentary. It's gone. All of this, it's evidence that God has forsaken you. It's evidence that you are wicked. And a person who has these experiences is figured to be one who does not know God. After Bildad has been reciting off all of these things, he finally concludes by saying, verse 21, surely such are the dwellings of the wicked, and this is the place of him who does not know God. All of these things happening to you, Job, it's evidence you don't know God. God has forsaken you. And the loss that he has experienced is taken as evidence that Job in the past has taken advantage of other people. So that's why he's lost what he had. It's evidence that he has oppressed people. Chapter 20 and verse 19, this is in Zophar's speech. After he has listed off what happens to a wicked person, all the problems, the difficulties that he has, then verse 19, for he has oppressed and forsaken the poor. He has seized a house which he has not built. You see, all the way along there are these sly insinuations and even direct charges, although they're speaking in the third person. They're speaking about the wicked. But what they're doing is pointing the finger at Job and saying, this is the evidence, Job. And then you see they're arriving at the conclusion, whenever a man loses out like that, it's evidence that he has oppressed and forsaken the poor. And he has claimed somebody's house that he hasn't built, somebody's home that he didn't have a right to. That's what you've been doing, Job. And what is happening to him, these friends of his declare, is that he is experiencing the wicked man's portion. Chapter 20, verses 20 to 29. There is a listing off, again, of what is the wicked man's portion. And we won't take time to go into it. It's just a delineation, a dark one, of bad experiences, difficult experiences, darkness and misery, and all the time describing what Job is going through. And then coming to the conclusion in verse 29, this is the wicked man's portion from God, even the heritage decreed to him by God. You see, the assumption is the sufferer is assumed to be forsaken by God. That results in a misunderstanding of God. All of this is taken as being God's judgment upon the person. A third assumption that leads to misunderstanding of God: circumstances are assumed to indicate the indifference of God. Circumstances are assumed to indicate the indifference of God. Now, that doesn't come out in so many words here, but this is one of the basic problems in man's thinking that leads to misunderstanding of God and rejection of God, that circumstances are assumed to indicate his indifference. And here is where there is the need for revelation. The revelation that we have in the Bible. If you look only at the circumstances, you must arrive at the conclusion that God doesn't care. You'll have it in your own life. There will be those things that happen to you and that you cannot understand, and that will make you decide, well, God just doesn't care. He's completely indifferent. But when you turn to the revelation, you find something else than that. You find that he does care. And Job had a glimmering of it. Notice what he has to say about the fact of a witness being in heaven for him. In Job 16, verse 19, there are these glimmerings of light that come out of the darkness as Job is crying out and thinks that God is against him. Yet there is the light that comes. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and my advocate is on high. The tragedy of it, he doesn't really believe it, because he goes on to say in verse 21, "Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor." If I could only really plead with him. And back of this is the idea, if I only had somebody in heaven to represent me before God. Well, there's a glimmer there when he believes that he does have an advocate there. And then notice how the light shines out of darkness for him, and what in chapter 19. And here is where we need the revelation, and Job didn't have what we have. Chapter 19, verse 25. In the darkness of his hopelessness, he still does have a hope, and he has something of an answer. Remember earlier he had asked the question, if a man die, will he live again? And he wavered back and forth. Sometimes, one time he made the statement he didn't think a man would live again. There was hope for a tree, if that died, that it might sprout again. But if a man died, that was the end of it. And here there is a light that comes. He's gotten some revelation from God. This tremendous portion, chapter 19, verses 25 to 27. "And as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth, even after my skin is destroyed. Yet from my flesh I shall see God, whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes shall see, and not another." The tremendous hope that is there. But this can only come from revelation, God revealing himself. As we go into the New Testament, we find that it is clearly presented there, that Jesus Christ is our Redeemer, and that he is the answer. He is all in this. But there is something more that is missed here. In this, when circumstances are assumed to indicate the indifference of God, Job got a tremendous answer to prayer that I think is many times not considered at all. He got a wish fulfilled. It didn't get fulfilled in his lifetime. This is one place where we've got to trust God, that if we really walk with him and really trust in him, there is going to be a continuance of his working on beyond our time, and there's going to be the fulfillment of our wishes out there beyond. Notice this, and this is in chapter 19, verses 23 and 24. His wish, his prayer, his heart cry, "Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that with an iron stylus and lead they were engraved in the rock forever." He got it. Here we have it. We're reading it. Exactly what he wished would happen, that his words were written down and that they were preserved permanently. Job never knew it. I meant you to say that he even got to the end of his life. He certainly never realized that there would be millions and millions of people who would read his words. This is the God we have, and so this is why you misunderstand God. If circumstances are assumed to indicate the indifference of God, you'll miss it. I like the records I get, the information I get about a man who has gone to be with the Lord, Mr. Thompson, who was the founder of the Pan American Testament League. I've mentioned him sometimes. He's written a little booklet that we should get some copies of that and have available for everyone, called Master Secrets of Prayer. That man he had learned the master secrets of prayer, and he was one who had learned to walk in such faith in God. He got things right on the line, though. He saw things fulfilled during his own lifetime in many ways. He would ask God to send a specific amount of money on a particular day, and he would get exactly that amount of money on that day. But that man's prayers have continued to be answered. We visited with his widow and a dear man who was working with her in the Pan American Testament League in Atlanta, Georgia, a few years ago, and it was delightful. We rode with them in the car for quite a number of miles because they took us to a place where I was to be doing preaching over the weekend, and almost the entire trip, in joy and laughter, they were telling about this man and the life that he lived with the Lord, and then telling about how his prayers are still continuing to be answered. It's still happening. He's going to be with the Lord now. I think it's 14 years or so since he died. But his prayers are still being answered. Things that he asked for back there, it looked like God didn't care then, but it's coming now. And there are more that will be coming yet. Let's not get caught in this problem of misunderstanding God. Let's be sure that we avoid these assumptions. Avoid the assumption, tragedy assumed to indicate the opposition of God. When tragedy comes to you, and it doesn't mean that God is against you. The sufferer is assumed to be forsaken by God. Don't accept that. Circumstances assumed to indicate the indifference of God. Don't believe it. Remember, we have a twisted view of God in this world. It's twisted. You cannot get a straight view of God looking at the circumstances of life. And the explanation of it is an enemy has done this. The explanation that was given by the man who had sowed the wheat, and then the tares grew up along with the wheat, and when he came out and looked it over, he didn't beat himself for it and kick himself. He said, an enemy has done this. And that's the reason for everything twisted in this world, and it is twisted. Don't you get any false conception of it and put on rose-colored glasses and say it isn't so. Things are out of shape, they're crooked, and men are wicked and mean. It's all out of shape. But an enemy has done this. However, God has answered our problems and answered our questions in the Lord Jesus Christ. The answer is in the revelation of this Word. In Jesus Christ is the proof that God is not against us, but He is for us. If God be for us, who can be against us? Paul says in Romans 8. And then goes on to say that is God going to condemn us? Why, it's God who has justified us. And is Jesus Christ going to be against us? Why, it's Jesus Christ who died and was buried and who rose and who lives to intercede for us. God is on our side when we trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. And God is lining everything up. And all of the questions of Job are answered in Jesus Christ. Turn to the Word of God. Get your information about God from His Word, not from circumstances. And don't you follow the false assumptions of men. Because God is love, and He has provided for us a wonderful life, for now and forever, in the Lord Jesus Christ.